His name will be forever linked with our nation's response to the COVID pandemic. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the former director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, has a new memoir out in which he discusses COVID-19, his recent congressional testimony, and more. CBS News chief medical correspondent Dr. Jon LaPook sat down with Dr. Fauci for a wide-ranging interview that'll air this weekend on CBS Sunday Morning. And Dr. LaPook joins us now for a preview. Welcome.
How are you, Cindy?
I'm doing great. And you've interviewed Dr. Fauci many times over the years.
Many times.
So what was different about this conversation?
Well, we're used to seeing a little slice of Tony, right?
Yes.
And you saw in the preview there, we're back in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And it was very sweet. He said, boy, there was a pharmacy where his father, worked, and he and his sister were up on the second floor. And he said, that's where my sister's room was. Boy, it looks a lot smaller now, And he talked about his dad, who was a pharmacist who they called Doc, and he gave advice to people, also gave out medications. I said, was he a good businessman? He said, no, he's a terrible businessman. Because he used to have people put things on the tab and then they would never pay. They often never not pay. Much to the chagrin of his sister and his mother, because they were one of the last houses on the block to get a TV set. But you get a sense of the taste of where he started from.
Yes, and very personal, it sounds like. Now, Dr. Fauci told you that his parents possessed a trait that helped in his own approach to the world. Let's listen to what he said about his dad.
My father was such a generous person and cared so much about the neighborhood that he lived in, that during tough times, some people couldn't afford to pay the bill for the pharmacy. So he would put it on a tab, and not infrequently, they still couldn't pay. And that's the reason why financially, this pharmacy was not a financial success.
What was it like listening to him talk about his parents?
Well, it was moving because, his guard was down there in Brooklyn.
Yes.
I think, he's had to have a thick skin. He's been under a lot of attack. Now he's back in his old neighborhood, right? And it was so sweet how he talked about his mother. We talk about empathy. There was a very important moment where he walked in and she was crying as she was reading the paper. And it turned out that she was reading about about Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And he said, look, I got to say, I was a little kid. I was playing like bang, bang, you're dead, you're a Nazi. And she said, look, every life is important. And you have to mourn every life, and think of all the thousands of people who died. And that was a very important moment for him, and he brought that forward, the importance of every single human being. And you saw that years later. Remember when during Ebola, when Nina Pham, who was one of the nurses who got infected, he was taking care of her at the NIH. And at the time, there was a lot of stigma associated with Ebola. Even if you were cured, which she was, recovered, that people still didn't want to touch you, and this was true around the world. And what he very consciously did was he gave her a big hug in front of all you. The cameras are click, 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 and then he brought her over to the White House where President Obama gave her a hug, and those were the hugs heard around the world. It's just a good little specific example of his empathy.
As you said, it's such a model for people to follow. Now, you were an intern when the first cases of AIDS was diagnosed. So what role did Dr. Fauci play at the beginning of that pandemic?
I thought yesterday for the first time, he was kind of like, the firemen who run into the burning building when everybody's running out. And that's what he did with HIV/AIDS at a time when people didn't want to touch it. You're afraid of getting infected yourself as a doctor or as a researcher. And at the very beginning, there was friction between him and the AIDS activists. And instead of saying, they were saying not enough was being done, and then they were right. And instead of just saying, go away, he invited them in, like physically, come into my office. He and people like Larry Kramer became friends. And even though Larry Kramer would say, in his description, like, they're still not doing enough, and he would call him a name or something, and then the cameras would go off. He goes, how is that? Are we good? So it wasn't personal, but you contrast that with right now, when, as he said, the country's so divided, and it is kind of personal. When you think about Tony Fauci, who was making hundreds of thousands of dollars for the NIH, he didn't offer this. I actually asked him, did you get offered a lot of money to leave? He goes, millions of dollars to leave, to go to pharma or private equity. And I said, why didn't you take it? He said, I want to help people. There's his parents again and the traits that they instilled in him.
What was Dr. Fauci's role in helping to develop the COVID vaccine?
This is such an important point, and people don't really know enough about it. So in 2000 or so, during the AIDS, when he was trying to get more funding for AIDS, and President Clinton said, what can I do to help? He said, what we need is a vaccine research center, a building where everybody can come together and we can all work. Well, that happened. 20 years went by or so, fade in, fade out, fade in. And what happened was there was the technology that was able to be developed during that period that led to the COVID vaccine being developed so quickly. And so from the moment that they actually got the sequence of it, the genetic sequence, it was 11 months till they had the first vaccine, which is a world record. Now you have to hand it to the Trump administration, because what they did is they took that vaccine and made it widely available really quickly, extraordinary process. And what they did is they gambled. They said, we're going to fund for pharma hundreds of millions of doses, a lot of money. If it doesn't work, because they hadn't studied it yet, we're out all that money. But if it does work, as soon as it says, okay, the FDA says go, boom, it's into arms for people who want to get it. That's exactly what happened. It was such a great example of the collaboration between the scientific community and the Trump administration back then. And of course, afterwards was a lot of friction.
Yeah.
And we know that story.
And that kind of leads into this. Do you think he still needs protection now?
He 100% needs protection.
Yeah.
He needed, when I interviewed him for 60 Minutes back in 2016, there were guards there, and at that time I remember him saying, give me a break. They're threatening his family and harassing them and threatening him. I've seen him over the years. He always has protection. He had protection in Brooklyn. He had protection when I interviewed him at his home. And he actually said that there was credible threats, including 2 people who were on their way to kill him.
Ugh.
So where did it go? Where did it go when we went from, the country in the 1950s just adoring Jonas Salk, who helped develop the polio vaccine. He was a national hero, to now where he actually has to be afraid that people are going to come and kill him. I mean, and it really is indicative of where we are. But I said to him, what do you think? Are you optimistic? Are you looking forward? And he's optimistic. Through all of this, Cindy, he's optimistic. And he said, I really think, Jon, that people have more in common than they have differences. And that when time goes by, hopefully it'll calm down. And he said, I believe in this country. I'm a believer in the United States. And so he's optimistic.
It's amazing he can keep that attitude with everything he's been through. Dr. LaPook, thank you so much for being here.
Cindy.
Sounds like a great interview. And again, Dr. LaPook's interview with Dr. Fauci will air this weekend on CBS Sunday Morning.